Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's great to be here. I love Istanbul, and it's also great that Renaissance is really pushing and encouraging the idea of sustainable design. So what I want to talk to you about today is the same subject as my TED Talk, but I'm actually going to be talking about slightly different projects. And what I want to persuade you of over the course of the next 15 to 20 minutes is that biomimicry will be one of the best sources of ideas to go beyond conventional approaches to sustainable design. So what do we mean by biomimicry? Well, this is one of the most widely known examples. This was the starting point for Velcro, the fastening material. So this was invented by a guy called George de Mestral. He took his dog for a walk one day, and the dog came out of the forest covered in these little seed burrs. And he took one of these home and looked at it under a magnifying glass, and that's what he saw. And that led him to invent Velcro. And then probably one of the oldest examples of biomimicry is the idea of looking at shells. So we know that architects like Brunelleschi learned a lot from seashells and bird shells to help him design a really thin and lightweight dome over the cathedral in Florence. What we have now is the huge advantage of superior scientific knowledge. So if we look at one of those shells under an electron microscope, that's what we see. It's made up out of these very thin layers of chalk material, and those are connected together with a flexible protein. And that gives it amazing resistance to crack propagation. So at a chemical level, that is 95% identical to ordinary blackboard chalk, but because of that microstructure, it achieves 3,000 times the strength. So if we could learn from biology and the way that it makes materials, then there's a very real chance we could start making our buildings using much less material and less energy. This is one of my current favorite examples of biomimicry. This is called the dog vomit slime mold. And slime molds are single-celled organisms that form minimum distance networks between sources of food. In 2009, some scientists at Hokkaido University in Japan carried out an experiment with a map of the Tokyo region. And they put a little source of food on each of the cities around Tokyo, and they put a slime mold on Tokyo itself. So the slime mold spread out quite quickly. It located all those sources of food and then started optimizing the connections between them. When it had finished, that exactly matched the railway layout in that part of Japan. It had taken the railway engineers thousands of hours to arrive at that optimization. The slime mold did it in just 26 hours. So that's another example of what we could learn from biology. And we could make more efficient cities, maybe more efficient distribution systems. And overall, you could look at nature as being like a design sourcebook in which all the products have benefited from a 3.8 billion year research and development period. Of course, I'm referring to the long and ruthless process of evolution. So how do we learn from this as architects? Well, this is an office project that we worked on recently, and we referred to nearly 100 different biological organisms to help us address all the different functional challenges. And as a team, we decided that daylight was likely to be one of the biggest drivers of the architectural form. And with our biologist as part of the design team, we looked at how light is gathered and distributed in biology. The first example we looked at is a kind of fish. It's called a spookfish. And it has these amazing mirror-shaped structures in its eyes. And those are able to focus very low levels of light coming up from the ocean and focus it onto its eyes. The next one we looked at is a plant that lives in deserts. It's called a stone plant. And for reasons of thermal stabilization, most of the plant is below the ground. And then it has what you could call a roof light, a window in the top, that allows the light to come down to the basement where the chemical reactions, the photosynthesis, can take place at a very steady temperature. Then we also looked at the brittle star. That's a type of starfish that lives as much as 500 meters below the ocean surface, where light levels are very low. And it's evolved a covering of near optically perfect lenses all over its skin. And those are able to focus very small amounts of light and movement so it can see predators before they see it. So these examples, and actually many others, encouraged us to think much more creatively and deliberately about how we would bring light into this building. A fairly conventional way of designing for light in offices is to just think about the right distance between the windows. In London, you can often find examples of really deep floors, like 30, 40 meters deep, and you know those are going to be high-energy buildings because they'll be artificially lit and air-conditioned. So what's the right dimension? We reckoned it was about 12 meters, so no one is further than 6 meters from the nearest window. And then thinking about what kind of building form that suggested, one approach would be to take these narrow floors and stack them up into a tower, which would work fine if we were working in a central urban location. We wanted to develop a concept that was more universal than that. So we looked at two other building forms, a ring of offices around a central atrium, and then a more linear approach, where we have two linear blocks of offices with a light-emitting atrium between. And it was that last one that seemed to work best when we analyzed the light levels. And using computer software, we looked at light levels on the plan of the building, and we found that we were getting this curved pattern of shading because of the shading effect of the opposite block. The next design move was to simply bend those floors so we get a very even quality of light all the way along. And that produced two further challenges. The first is that narrow floors aren't particularly good for creative clusters of people. You need some spaces that are wider. And also, this wasn't making very efficient use of a rectangular site. And we thought we would probably end up with a rectangular site. So learning further ideas from biology about surface area to volume optimization, we undulated this plan form so that we still had no point further than 6 meters from the window. Now we were getting more facilities for creative clusters of people, and we were making better use of a rectangular site. Now looking at the building in section, but still thinking about daylight, we found it was quite easy to get enough light in the top parts of the building. The challenge was how to get the light further down. And we looked at a rainforest plant called Anthurium warocquinum. And that plant lives in low light levels. It has lenses on its leaves. And somehow those are able to focus diffuse light. So the idea is we'll be able to focus light into fiber optic tubes and then channel it around the building. One of the conclusions was that there was a good case for shaping the building to bring light further down. And then we proposed in the middle, we'd have this large mirror based on the spookfish that would bounce light into the lower parts of the building. And then thinking about what we would do underneath that large mirror, we thought this was a great opportunity to create a really dramatic meeting space that could be used for events and would add value to the building. And if I had more time, I'd love to tell you how we learned from termites to design a self-heating and self-cooling system for the building, how we learned from folding leaves and folding beetle wings to design a sun shading system that lets in exactly the right amount of light and converts all surplus light to electricity, and how we learned from shells and curved leaves to design a new glazing system that should achieve a roughly 90% saving in embodied energy. This is how the building looks now after we've completed the commercial feasibility study. So I think you can see the ideas I was talking about, the form driven by daylight. That's the spookfish light reflector in the middle, and that's how the atrium would look. And we're pretty confident that this will increase the productivity of the people inside by as much as 10%. And that's worth a huge amount of money. One of the engineers involved has predicted that if this gets built, it should be one of the lowest energy office buildings in the world. The next scheme I'm going to talk about is a new concept for a data center. So data centers use a huge amount of energy just to keep them cool. If we have a data center in a city or a server in a building, there's a lot of energy required to cool it down. So how would nature solve this problem? Well, nature would probably just go somewhere that is cooler. That's what animals would do. So the first design move here was to locate the server in a location that is already very cold. This is a mountain in Norway, and it's already been carved out for marble mining. So it has 90 kilometers of tunnels, and these are all at a steady temperature of about 5 degrees centigrade. So then the challenge was, how do we draw that free source of cool air through the server? And we looked at branching systems in biology. And it seems that most branching systems in biology follow a mathematical principle that's referred to as Murray's law. There's a very constant ratio between the diameters of the vessels, a very constant angle, and there's also a certain finessing to those junctions. And this appears to be an evolved minimum energy solution. So instead of having the data blocks in long rows, which would mean you'd have a lot of pipework and a lot of bends, we clustered them in circles to minimize the pipework, and then we designed that branching system using Murray's law. And that might look quite kind of crazy and biological, but it's that way because we followed the principles of biology. We're not just trying to look like biology, we're trying to function the way biology does. And that should be, again, if it gets built, I wish it had been, it hasn't yet, but if it gets built, it should be one of the lowest energy data centers in the world. And that's how it looks like, the showpiece server. It's a bit of a James Bond-like project, this, because first of all, you have to come in through a sort of laser scanner, you go down this long tunnel, you get into a boat to cross this underground lake, and then you'll end up at the central cavern. So we're hoping that it does get built. The next one I'm going to talk about is a project we've been working on in the Middle East. And sometimes extreme environments are the most enjoyable when you're into biomimicry, because you can find amazing adaptations to those environments. This is a lizard that can drink with its feet. If it's standing on damp ground, the water tracks up grooves in its skin all the way up to its mouth, and then it licks its lips and looks rather pleased with itself. So this project was based on 3 key ideas, and I'll explain all of these. The first is camel's nostrils, the second is Persian ice making, and the third is solar cooling. So starting with camel's nostrils, camels are a pretty amazing species, actually. When a camel breathes in, he breathes in very dry desert air, and his nostrils look like this. They have these very intricate passageways, and they're called nasal turbinates. And as the camel breathes in, those surfaces evaporate water into the air, so it's cool and humid, and it's less of a shock to the system. And then when the camel breathes out, that air is now warm and humid, and it's passing those cool surfaces. So a lot of that water recondenses and is recaptured by the camel. The small amount of moisture that it loses when it breathes out, it uses that for evaporative cooling purposes, so it can keep its eyeballs and its brain as much as 6 degrees C cooler than the rest of its body. So the next idea was Persian ice making. Now, the ancient Persians knew how to make ice thousands of years ago. And to explain this, let's look at some comparative temperatures. Let's say the temperature of the desert at night is 30 degrees C. The temperature of outer space is minus 273 degrees C. And what they did is that last thing in the evening, they would put down a bed of straw with a shallow ceramic tray and a black glaze, and then a thin layer of water. And on a clear night, that radiative effect out to outer space was enough to turn that water into ice. The third example, or third idea for this project is solar cooling. So here we're proposing to use high-performance evacuated tube solar collectors, which produce very high temperature hot water, close to 100 degrees C. And you can put that into a piece of equipment called an adsorption chiller. It works a bit like a fridge, and it produces cooling. So with a heat input, you get cooling out. And what's nice about that is that on the sunniest days, you get the maximum cooling. Right, so how do we put these ideas together? Well, the basis of this scheme is quite a clever roof. So we have a high emissivity surface, like the ice maker, and during the day, that's shaded with louvers. At night, we open the louvers to create this radiation path to outer space. And that means that the underside will be slightly cooler. And then what we want to do is maximize the surface area for condensation, like the camel's nostril. So we're creating a lot of surface area, these kind of fins that stand down. And then we're applying to that a special mesh that has been optimized for dew collection. And then into these gaps between the fins in here, we can run solar cooling so that the combined effect of this is that we will get a lot of water condensing on those surfaces, and it runs down to channels, and we can collect it. So this will work particularly well in the evening when the humidity rises to close to 100%. And then thinking about the building form, well, we need the wind to pass through this, but we don't want the air close to the ground because that's too hot. We want the wind slightly further off the ground. So that suggested a kind of scoop, a wind catcher on the front of the building. And then we were also told that this might have to form an entrance to a building behind. So we started to think of something like a grand arch. And then putting these two forms together led to this shape, a bit like a Pringle. So this is the camel's nostril roof here. And underneath, we have a sculpted landscape with a garden. And then that's the water collection surface. And we also have a performance space in here. So the water will run down to the middle, and then when the performance is ready to start, we'll have a special sort of shower of rain that falls. And this is an early sketch that I did of the project. So this will be a roof that captures water and uses that to supply an oasis garden filled with rare plants from the Middle East. And this is a later rendering, so we've still got the camel's nostril roof at the front, and then the main part of the museum is at the back there, and that's a section through the museum. And another view. This time we were learning from bird skulls to design an incredibly lightweight structure. The final project I'm going to talk about very briefly is the Sahara Forest Project. So I talked about this in my TED Talk, and I'm going to kind of pick up where I left off. So this was the main image I showed, and this is a model for how we could create zero-carbon food in some of the most water-stressed parts of the planet, as well as creating renewable energy and revegetating deserts. And I think all projects need a stroke of luck to happen, particularly projects like this. And we actually managed to get some very nice publicity for this, but we didn't get a sort of tycoon phoning up and saying, yeah, I'll have one of those, please. So I sent the newspaper articles to various people that I'd met at conferences, and then eventually this guy from Norway phoned up, and he runs an environmental organization called the Bellona Foundation. And to cut a long story short, they became a partner in the project, and they brought with them amazing funding and political connections. One of the first things we said to our new Norwegian friends was, we're very pleased about the project, we're confident about what it can do, but we don't feel as though we've got it in front of the right people yet. A few months later, they heard that the King of Jordan was on a state visit to Norway, and they managed to get a meeting with him, and he had with him one of his ministers whose genuine job title was the Minister for Mega Projects. And they both loved it, and we thought, yes, now we're getting it in front of the right people. So that led to us building a version of this in Qatar, which was opened during the climate change talks in 2012. And this allowed us to test all the technical aspects of the scheme, the solar energy, the greenhouse, the desert revegetation. And alongside that more technical side of things, we wanted to explore the regenerative benefits. I believe we need to go beyond ordinary sustainable design to regenerative design. So rather than just mitigating negatives, we need a design approach that actually optimizes positives, that restores ecosystems. So here we started with a completely empty desert site. And this little sequence shows what we achieved in terms of biodiversity. So we just made a note of all the birds, mammals, and insects that appeared on site. And the first things, this is set out according to taxonomic classifications. So the first things to appear were flies, nothing very interesting there. But then, literally the same day that the first plants came to site, we had the first birds. Soon after that, we had the first insects, we had grasshoppers and crickets. And just a month later, we had the first butterfly. And this was nearly 10 kilometers from the nearest bit of planting. Then, as the plants got established, we got more birds, we had more insects. And then we had a bit of a problem. We had, sorry, I'll just go back one. We had a bit of a problem with rats. So their numbers were expanding rather dramatically, which was a bit of a pain, but still we were getting more birds and insects. Then we had mice to deal with as well, but still more birds and more insects. Then when the algae ponds were filled, we had dragonflies within 3 days. The next thing to appear was a cat, a feral cat, and that started to get the mice and rats under control, so that was good news. And then we had quite a rare bird appearing. This is called a hoopoe, not often seen in Qatar. And then other types of bird, like rufous-tailed shrikes, more birds, and eventually we had the first indigenous mammal. It's called a jerboa. And this was all achieved in just 8 months on a site 100 meters by 100 meters. And I'm very confident that if we were to do this on a bigger scale, that regenerative effect would be even more pronounced. And now we're just about to build in Jordan, and we're hoping that if the project scales up, it could make a significant contribution to food, water, and energy security. And to conclude now, what we've seen is really just a tiny glimpse of what exists in a design sourcebook we're only just beginning to understand. 3.8 billion years of research and development. 3.8 billion years of brilliant ideas illuminated by previously unparalleled scientific knowledge, facilitated by previously unimaginable digital design tools. We've never had such an opportunity to rethink and design solutions fit for the next billion years. And the final point I want to make is really about leadership. I think one of the problems, or perhaps one of the mistakes of the environmental movement, is that very often it was waiting for leadership. And I know lots of people, when Obama was elected, they said, finally, the leader we've been waiting for. And, you know, Obama did a certain amount, but there's only a certain amount that one guy can do. And rather than waiting for leadership, I'd like you to consider this. We are the leaders we have been waiting for. Ordinary people like you and like me, shaping a positive future. And shaping the future is not as strange as it might sound. Sure, you can let the future happen to you if you want to. But if you choose to shape the future, that's what you're doing every moment of your waking life. Moment to moment to moment, you are shaping the future in the decisions you make, the actions you take, the companies you join, and so on. So let's decide on the future we want, and then let's make it happen. Thank you.